Hello and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we'll be journeying with the moon while Jupiter is in Cancer. So each month we'll release an episode to coincide with the new moon, and today's episode is the moon in Libra. My name's Tara Stevenson, and I'm a British astrologer.
I'm Helen. I'm a British astrologer as well from Scotland.
Great, and we're so excited to be joined by a fantastic astrologer today, Michelle. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining Lunar Reflections. It's a pleasure to have you on. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Tara and Helen, for having me. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Michelle. I am a 24-year-old astrologer from Lima, Peru. Currently based in Amsterdam. I've been studying Hellenistic astrology for about 5, 6 years now, and then consulting professionally for about 2. I'm also currently in the process of getting my master's in spirituality and religion at the University of Amsterdam. That's been really fun and exciting. And then kind of dipping my toes into medieval Islamicate astrology as well for predictive purposes, and that's been really enlightening. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Now that sounds amazing, especially that course. And, we were talking offline earlier around the accessibility of these kind of spirituality, astrology type courses in the academic sphere, which definitely helps kind of counteract the stigma against around studying this. So it's great to hear that you're embarking on this really exciting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And people don't realize just how esoteric all of the classics are, and all of these things that we think are only about rationality, and thinking rationally. It's like, no, Plato was weird. He was weird. All these ancient, Greek philosophers, they have much to say about many more different ways of knowing that people realize. So it's been there all along, right? It's just about the stigma, I think, about moving past the weirdness of the woo-woo, right? That has is really exciting. Yeah.
And it's just fantastic that you're studying that and that it's coming more out into the kind of academic mainstream. Because I remember reading it about Pythagoras as well, who we were taught in school. It's Pythagoras' theorem. It's all about calculating triangles, but actually he was a mystic as well. And so
Mhm.
there seems to be this program in the modern era to like systematically go back and remove all the things that great
Mhm.
thinkers have said that didn't fit the mold of straight
Mhm.
rationalism.
Absolutely. Pythagoras was actually one of the first philosophers that they mentioned in my first class. Yeah, how they were like all communing with spirits. Don't quote me on this too soon because I just started really learning about this like concretely. Yeah, but they were, yeah, their expansion for the ways that they, could garner information were much more broad and much more spiritual and much more intuitive than people actually realize. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that does make sense because they had less, in terms of like modern technology and the way in which we've advanced in terms of science, etc. They probably weren't as distracted by all of that and were able to be more intuitive, and they had to rely on what they could see and feel like in the sky. And so I feel like there was that deeper connection. So it's great that we're able to go back and revisit that because we are, as astrologers ourselves, we resonate with that wholeheartedly. So
hmm
I'm super glad that you're doing something like this, and it's helpful for listeners and other people who are thinking about studying astrology or, just in their journey, that it's becoming a lot more accessible for all the right reasons.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even in like the Hermes Trismegistus, some may call him the father of astrology. Even in his Corpus Hermeticum, like it's a being that comes down to share this knowledge or share this information, right? So when I think about like how are they able to like figure this out, and how do they discover such a system? I'm like, it was always, if we look back on like the so much mythology, it's always a being that comes that shares some sort of information. There's a whole thing in Plato's Phaedrus about divine madness, right? How I was thinking about this the other day, like to be able to comprehend or understand such systems, like it's not that you're not normal, but you got to be a little bit crazy. And that's where the craziness, connects to divine madness, that connects to the ability to comprehend such a system. So it makes me feel a little bit better about being told that you're crazy for believing all this stuff. It's like that's the whole point, actually. That's the you're able to do and practice and comprehend, again, using that word, because of the madness. So yeah.
And just before we move on to linking that to the modern astrology context as well, and I'm in the process of reading Carl Jung's autobiography just now, and I think he would relate to what you've just said about, because he was actually derided for a lot of his career by many within his chosen profession of psychiatry, but actually he was steeped in the classics himself, and he had that view of that there's more, and even things like beings coming to us and revealing information, he might view that more through a collective unconscious lens. But either
Hmm.
way, there's something more than the rationalistic ego going on, and I think more and more our culture seems to be reconciling itself to the fact that we've been systematically ignoring a lot of reality for several hundred years now, and it's not sustainable.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I feel like whenever I think about like who would I hang out with like back in the day, like I really do feel like me and Young would be like besties, like having conversations deep in the night, talking about like the wonders of the world. Like I do think you're right, Helen, we are coming back around to that way of thinking. And everything's about cycles with astrology, everything's about cycles with history. And I love actually where we are at this point because we are in almost like resurgence, taking it like to a very basic modern, like whenever you watch TV, like you can now see like loads of people are wearing like their sign around their neck. Like it's
Hmm.
just becoming so, and I do wonder, I do think like the Gen Z wave has definitely helped kind of propel that in a good way, but also we have to think about the basics and the fact that we still have all of this like history that we have to like link it back to. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time, to be honest.
It is, and I think, thinking about the time that we're in at the moment, and Jupiter almost, one of the bases of this podcast is around Jupiter's transit through Cancer and Jupiter's exaltation in Cancer, and Jupiter's the planet that brings a lot of that kind of thinking around, you know, meaning and the big picture in the universe and those kind of things. So I think for me personally, actually Jupiter's transit through Cancer, although it's been my seventh house and there's been a lot to do with relationships of all kinds. There's also been, similar to what you were saying, Tara, quite a positive dimension from that, kind of engaging in philosophy and thinking about consciousness studies and how my past life in archaeology connects with my astrology studies and things like that as well. So I don't know how that, Michelle, for yourself, how's that Jupiter and Cancer transit manifested so far?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Jupiter and Cancer for me, when I think about, this position, I think about how our hopes and dreams are as important as to survival as like eating food and drinking water. There's something about the nutrition of having hopes and dreams, and a purpose, a sense of purpose that really resonates deeply with me. Um, for me, Jupiter in Cancer has been going through my 12th. I have it together like this with Venus in the solar revolution. I think that speaks to like, moving, immigrating really, really far away. I would put immigration in the 12th. I would put like like a trip that's like maybe like 2, 3 months, but you go home in the ninth, but like immigrating, like going somewhere really far and like almost like exiling yourself, right? I would put in the 12th. So that's been really prominent for me. But in terms of the topic that you mentioned about, how Jupiter and Cancer, I think it was Tara that mentioned uh, uh, about like society and Gen Z really bringing in this astrological perspective. Yeah, it kind of makes sense because I feel like universally we have lost sight of our sense of spirituality in the modern world, and in a way that it's tethered not to institutionalized religion, but in a way that, makes people feel seen and understood, and especially at a time where social media and living in a capitalistic society, like there isn't that outlet for people nowadays. So we see things like idolatry, like idolizing influencers or pop stars, right? So I feel like astrology has been an outlet for a lot of young people to kind of find some form of center and some sort of like dialogue between you and something bigger than you that isn't constrained by again, that religious institutionalized bureaucracy. So that's also what I've been seeing. Definitely saw it already coming up when Jupiter was in Gemini, but now that it's in Cancer, I feel like it's becoming much more rooted in some ways, and yeah, not as crazy, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, that does make sense. And like when you were both talking, I was thinking about how Cancer is about our sense of belonging. And so I feel
Mm-hmm.
that this Jupiter in Cancer transit is helping us to connect with like-minded people and feel that we belong, rooted in spirituality, and how we can expand that so that we can feel more connected. Because in this capitalistic kind of modern world, which promotes individualism, this Jupiter in Cancer does feel like it's ushering us all in, especially after that chaotic kind of Jupiter in Gemini transit where we
Mm-hmm.
had so many different things going on and so many things to kind of download. It's almost like, well, let's bring it back to what's important. And like you said, Michelle, about that rootedness, I think that
Mm-hmm.
does make sense. And it's interesting, you both talked about your different kind of experiences. It will depend on your natal chart where this Jupiter in Cancer transit is happening. It's happening in the same house for me as well, Michelle. So it's
Mm-hmm.
happening in the 12th. And so while we our family had been thinking about immigrating, and we think that that might be on pause. So I do agree that the 12th house definitely is linked to immigration. But what's been interesting for my husband, who's also a Leo rising, is he's now starting to become a lot more spiritually aware, which beforehand
Mm-hmm.
he's a Taurus, he's got very grounded, grew up in a Christian household and almost
Mm-hmm.
rejected Christianity early in life, but also rejected any kind of belief system. And so
Mm-hmm.
what's been amazing is watching his growth because of this Cancer in Jupiter in his 12th house, where he's just slowly starting to open his eyes to what else is out there. And I think that is almost like a collective reflection as well, what's going on. So I think it's super interesting.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. That's beautiful, especially having like the greater benefic come into a house that holds like a lot of shame, holds a lot of difficulty. And I've seen it come up before with Jupiter and like especially in the darker houses as like religious trauma sometimes or difficulty with your relationship with spirituality or the greater, beyond. Um, that's really beautiful, and I'm really excited for him.
So am I, yeah. So I'm like, welcome to our side. I come with open arms, like please join us. So that's
Mhm,
been really beautiful to see his story. And I think, you see all these different personal stories, but they all have kind of like a similar thread that kind of connects us. And I think that's the job of, and I can see why Jupiter exalts in Cancer. And that's why I've been
mhm,
so interested in journeying alongside its
mhm,
transit this year with the moon, because I think by
mhm.
doing that, you do get a greater understanding of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about the new moon in Libra, which is the basis of this episode. And that's taking place on the 21st of October at 28 degrees. So it'll be affecting late degree cardinal placements. So for those of you that have placements at Aries, Libra, Cancer, or Capricorn, you might feel the effects of this Libra moon more than others. I've pulled up a chart for where I'm located, so it might be different depending on where you are. But this pulls up a Sagittarius rising chart and it puts the new moon in the 11th house. And when I was looking at the chart, I thought it was really interesting that this new moon is ruled by this beautiful Libra Venus, but it's kind of at 9 degrees and it's chilling on its own. It's kind of not really making any aspects to any of the personal placements, but it is squaring that Jupiter in Cancer and also opposing Chiron, which I don't know why, but I just kind of drew straight into that Chiron, and I want to talk about that a little bit more. So I was also thinking about how we've had these eclipses in Libra and Aries last year, and we had a solar eclipse in Libra October 2nd last year. And the reason why I'm thinking about this is because I feel like this new moon, which will happen at the end of Libra season, previously our new moons have been happening at the beginning. So we almost would have experienced Libra season and then we have this kind of new moon ushering in. And I do think it would be useful to look back to those eclipses that we've recently had, because I feel like the story is kind of continuing there, even though it's new. And I don't know why I just got drawn into that opposition with Chiron, and it made me feel like, are we supposed to be sitting with uncomfortable feelings? Are we supposed to be healing from past emotional trauma? Will there be elements of like self-doubt or vulnerability linked to those eclipses? Like what's been going on in that Libra house for you, for example? I don't know what anyone else thinks about the chart and if they've had a chance to have a look at it.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, just when you were saying about that sitting with uncomfortable feelings in Chiron, it also made me think of the yod aspect pattern that the new moon itself has with um Neptune and Uranus. So an asset that's quite a modern lens, but it's the inconjunct aspect is like this. It's not, it's more uncomfortable than opposition, almost because opposition's a constructive, it's got flow, it's got the same modality, whereas the inconjunct aspect is quite, it's a little bit more of a disruptive, uncomfortable feeling. So I'm wondering if maybe it's a sort of inlet where some of those world events are affecting us, and that would echo your interpretation with the Chiron opposition as well, which I think is quite interesting. And I love what you're saying about the previous eclipse series and thinking of this more in that longer term lens as well. I hadn't really thought about that. What jumped out for me, I think, more than anything was the water grand trine. And so that's got, for people listening, we've got Saturn that's retrograded back into the late degrees of Pisces. We've got Jupiter in Cancer, which we've been discussing. And then there's a tight Mars-Mercury conjunction in Scorpio. And I was reflecting on this and why it feels so related. And as you said, Tara, there's like a square between Venus and Jupiter, but also thinking about rulership from the point of view of terms and decans as well. So we've got Saturn as the exaltation ruler of Libra, but it also has its exaltation degree in the third decan as well. So it feels especially kind of relevant. And then there's also Jupiter, I think, is the ruler of that decan itself. So, and then I think by another tradition, Mercury is said to be the ruler. I think, Michelle, you probably can keep me right on that. So almost you've got in this flowing water grand trine configuration, which have some kind of soft influence, together with Venus on what's happening in the new moon. And it almost feels like there's this emotional, insightful dynamic or undercurrent to whatever it kind of signifies. Michelle, I know you know a lot more about decans than I do.
Yeah, I was gonna say what you both noted about the kind of like healing aspect. I think that makes sense, especially because I'm looking at obviously the new moon, right, at 28 degrees Libra, very end of Libra. Maybe could be a good segue to talking about the decans, but it is a very chaotic part of Libra. For me, Libra tells the story of what happens when humans have to live in society and among other people. Because we as humans, right? Like when you incarnate as a mortal, you live among other mortals. And I think Libra tells the story of what happens when we have to coexist, right? So before we even like touch the third decan of Libra, I am looking at the first decan of Libra, where Venus, the ruler of the new moon, is going to be. And this is quite a meditative place. It's a much more calm place than the last decan of Libra, but connects this idea of like, chaos happening in the third decan. Because to live in a society, right, is to live among the chaos of people. But in the first decan, it's ruled by the two swords. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, already talking about the decans. But it is about going into yourself and going within yourself to contemplate deeply as a way to get to a place of quote unquote good judgment, which is what it's described in the Picatrix, right? Good judgment occurs in the first decan of Libra. So obviously with the square from Jupiter as well, there is something there about judgment and big thoughts and ideas and how it feels, right? Yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Yeah, no, that sounds, I mean, I love both of your kind of takes on it, and that's why I love like coming together with different astrologers, because we all have our slightly different perspective and we see different things will jump out to us. Another thing that jumped out that I feel is supportive is that Scorpio in Mars, because we have not had a dignified Mars since May 2024, not that I've been counting. And I'm just like, how is this going to feel, especially because we have obviously a dignified Venus as well, and we're talking about the axes of relationships, and Mars and Venus are right there doing their thing. So it feels like, yes, there's going to be this square to Jupiter and we're going to have this opposition to Chiron, but this grand trine that you've talked about, Helen, does feel supportive. And I do think like this, having this dignified Mars and Venus will definitely help support that. So since we've talked a little bit about decans, it'd be great to have your take and just like a simplified like explanation of it, and then maybe talk a little bit about what it's like having your moon in Libra.
Yeah, of course. So for me, the decans are the lay of the land, right? Like a sign is not just a sign or a symbol, it's an actual place or location in which the planets will cross, right? So the decans can tell you a lot about context, right? What is the planet experiencing, seeing, meeting through that path as they're crossing through the zodiac, right? So you can also describe it as like a container of sorts, what's happening in the container, that's influencing or impacting the story of the planet itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Um, in terms of my chart, my ascendant is at 0 degrees Leo, putting Libra in my third house. I have moon at 11 degrees, so it's middle decan Libra. For those who know about the decans of Libra, we're probably thinking like, ouch. And yes, it's a double Saturn ruled. So there's a big emphasis in my life, in my communities, with my siblings as well. And I have a very big circle of like aunties and cousins, right? That are very impactful in my life. And even that because the third house rules early education up until high school, even that area of my life also spoke much about my trajectory. So you can already see, and that's also like, rejoicing moon. So of course there is ruled by a benefic of sect Venus. So there is this positive experience with my community, my neighbors, right? The areas that I live in. That's also really important to my sense of like emotional nutrition and physical nutrition. Um, so yeah, honestly, rejoicing planets do their thing and they do it very, very well. And I think that's also what makes me a great astrologer is my ability to connect with people in a very, mindful way in the sense of like it is about thoughts and ideas. And I'll get into that when we talk about Libra, how it's an air sign, right? When we communicate with people or we establish relationships with people, we are essentially communicating with them. Um, so there's a lot of themes like that that come up for me in my life. As moon is also sect light, very, very influential.
No, I think that's really interesting what you said, especially around the third house and kind of your early experiences um, in childhood. It was just making me reflect on my IC is
Hmm.
in that same decan, which I
Wow.
hadn't really connected until you said. And there is a lot, my even though I'm a Leo rising like yourself, my IC floats into the third house. So that's why it's in
That's
Libra and it's at
fascinating. Yeah.
18 degrees. And I've been preparing for the astrology of family dynamics, a talk that I'm going to do at the
Mm-hmm.
astrologers conference, a little shameless plug there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about how the third house is actually not just siblings, but people that you call family, like friends that you call
Mm-hmm.
family, but also
Mm-hmm.
cousins. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm an only child, but I had so many cousins who were like my
Mm-hmm.
siblings.
Wow.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting that you're talking about this second decan and what that represents, because I do kind of resonate with the IC there. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's such an interesting concept, the decans. It gives such nuance. And like you said, it's not just the sign, it's about, well, which part of the zodiac is it incrementally moving through? And
Mm-hmm.
and you see that difference. It must be it makes sense why the moon rejoices in the third house. And it's quite nice that it's also ruled by, I don't know where your Venus is. Like, what's your moon ruled by?
Yeah, my moon is ruled by Venus in Leo. It's also in the first house, 28 degrees, 27 degrees, sorry, Leo. So by like really by the end of it near Regulus. At least when at the time that I was born. So it has like a impact, right, on my experience with myself, with my identity, with how I relate to other people. So that's very Venusian and it's very on the nose, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hearing that coming through when you were talking about that third house moon and how it has a bearing on your identity and also how you work with others in your astrology. It feels like quite a large part of your life in a really nice way. It's a dignified kind of moon, and yeah, it's kind of a happy in Libra. And it sounds like the Decans have really helped you to add nuance and depth and layers to that
Oh
understanding.
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think with anybody with Libra placements, like inevitably this idea of relationship really comes through. For me, it's this idea of relationships not just with other people, but relationships with yourself and relationships with the world, with the natural world, with the universe. And you can see that move progressively through the decans, right? Like first decan is like the discovery of relationship, right? What happens when you have to coexist with other people? And the second decan is about, okay, now that we've discovered this idea of relationship, that humans do have to live amongst other people, what happens when we commit to these relationships, right? And then in the third decan, I think this idea of commitment and compromise is reflected into a wider scope of commitments to myself and commitments that I have with the universe, with the world, the natural world, with the people around me, my surroundings, right? uh that's what I mean by Libra is about relationships, like all encompassing, right? Not just with other people, but with many different things and beings and yeah, the natural world also comes up, especially in the last decade. So it is very relational, as one would think, right? Or assume. But obviously, this added layer of air, right, is about communicating, right? Because what else are you doing when you're establishing a relationship with someone, right? It is to communicate this thing, right? These thoughts, these ideas. And I think that says much about the quality and the essence of Libra, right? And then, of course, we can get into the cardinality of it, right? That to communicate with someone, it's also an action that you take, right? You also communicate, in a sense, to move a relationship forward. It is about change. It is about movement, right? And even just looking at which planets domicile, exalt, or fall, right? In in Libra, you can learn so much about the sign, right? Domicile of Venus, exaltation of Saturn, and the fall of the Sun, right? The detriment of Mars. You can see here an elevation of this idea of commitment and a moving away from this idea of like sovereign individuality, because it's really hard to be a sovereign self when you're meant to compromise within a relationship. So it makes sense for the two planets that represent this idea of like almost like ego, right? And this like strong sense of like protective identity, Sun, Mars, right? There's a reason why Sun exalts in a Mars sign that you can see quite clearly just based off what feels good and doesn't in Libra. So it just makes sense that Venus and Saturn, right, have this really interesting relationship in the sign. Yeah.
Wow. You've said so many things, and my head's just like whirling, going, remember to say that, remember to repeat, respond to this, da 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 da. And my head's just like, so I may be all over the place, but there's so much that you said that I was like really resonating with. The first is around the idea of how communication is rooted in relationships. We know that when we talk about relationship breakdowns, the lack of communication is often because of that. And so Libra is like with that air and the ability to connect with others means they are able to bring those people together. And it's interesting because whenever I see Libra placements, I do often see the role of peacemaker, the one that's able to bring people together and see that how are we all the same rather than how are we different. And also, I was thinking about the Aries axes, and
Hmm.
sometimes we see that Libra is like the polite Aries because it's, and I don't know what you think about that, but I think people misunderstand, like sometimes can, what's the word? underestimate Libra. I think when we think
Mm-hmm.
about the cardinal signs, we jump to
Mm-hmm.
Aries and Capricorn because of that exaltation and dignified Mars, and
Mm-hmm.
Cancer and Libra can sometimes just get a little bit forgotten. But I do think it's wrong to do that because there's so much that Libra can bring. So what else I was thinking was really interesting is yes, the second decan is double ruled by Saturn, which obviously it's a malefic, so can feel uncomfortable. But because, you mentioned before, Michelle, that well, Saturn exalts in Libra.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there is support there and
Oh
it
yeah.
and it harps back to that idea of commitment. How
Mm-hmm.
can I think about marriage and I think about vows and I
Mm-hmm.
think about how
Mm-hmm.
you do things through sickness, like through illness, through health, through good, through bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that like never giving up and seeing that relationships need work.
Yeah,
And I think that
absolutely.
really helps understand Libra.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Once we get to talk about the second decan, it's really interesting because like, for example, the tarot image of the second decan is quite sad. It's the Three of Swords, right? Traditionally not, you don't get excited when you see the Three of Swords come up. But when you look at the images of like in the Picatrix, right, or the descriptions by Agrippa, like there is this idea of like the good life that can come up. There's a lot of duality that comes up in Libra, just primarily through the idea of like the scales, right, and also all the opposition with Aries, right? There's this idea of like cohesion and severance as a cyclical thing in this axis. So absolutely, there is it has its difficulties as any contract would, when anything that denotes or requires responsibility and commitment, right? But when you do commit to the good and the bad, right? The middle decan of Libra is also the only decan out of the 36 decans that denotes specifically like uh images of marriage, right? A lot of good can come from that, absolutely, and that makes sense for like the greater malefic exalts in a benefic sign, you know. There is a lot of good that can come through when you hunker down and commit to things. So yeah, absolutely.
Even just that, the greater malefic exalting in a benefic sign, it's that duality again, it's that balance that is signified by the scales. It's such, there's so many layers of symbolism there for that. I absolutely love
Mhm.
that. And whenever I see someone with Saturn in Libra, whenever I'm reading a chart, I always know they're going to be really socially aware. They're going to have some kind of sense of social responsibility and responsibility in relationships and to others, and in a very positive way. And sometimes you get that with Venus Saturn aspects as well, that it's easy, one that's easy to look at through it. Oh no, that doesn't seem good, but actually can be very positive, just in the same way as you were talking about around commitment and that sense of social responsibility. I think you said earlier in relation to Decan One, we live in a society. We're not, we can't just be a whole Aries. We can't just be entirely in Aries because we're individuals, but that individuality is in part defined by the interconnectivity with others,
Mhm. Mhm.
structures as well, and structures and building structures, and it makes me think of Saturn as well. And again, Libras is that interrelationality between humans.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for example, if we start moving to talking about the decans, introducing Libra Decan I, right? It is co-ruled by in both decanic traditions, Moon and Venus. It's called A Blindfold and a Sword by Austin Coppock. T.S. Chang calls it Blind Equilibrium. And then it comes up as Peace Restored in Book T, and then just Peace in the Book of Thoth. So there is this big idea of peace that comes in Libra, especially like internal peace when it comes to this idea of like experiencing society with other people. Of course, people are gonna piss you off. You know what I mean? You're not gonna like everybody. Not everybody's going to be accepting, sorry, of your identity, right? But how can we coexist within that dynamic, right? So there's a lot of, yeah, references to, okay, like how can we find peace, right? It is ruled by the Two of Swords, right? I don't know if the people listening know what it looks like, but if you can look it up really quick, it's a woman, you know, presumably justice, right? Sitting on the shore, blindfolded, holding two swords under the moon. T.S. Chan describes it as, she says, when I think of this card, I think of the mind making room within itself for another's point of view, right? And you can kind of see it when she's like holding it, right? It's like holding these two opposing, differing ideas. And I think the fact that she's blindfolded is also really poignant, right? And this is Chang on being blindfolded. It takes away the sense of sight, which allows you to feel or adjust your way towards alignment. And then we see that connection of the moon and the ocean being present within this card, right? Yes, Libra is an air sign. It is about the mind. It is about communicating. But there is this very lunar quality to especially this first decan that talks about intuition, the sense of peace and calm that comes when you meditate, you close your eyes and you think, okay, what's the best way to move forward? You know, if me and my partner or the person that I'm in a partnership with aren't agreeing, right? It's quite meditative, right? This Two of Swords kind of represents this idea of like taking a step back to allow another's point of view to come into your worldview, right? And to connect with your feelings. And then there's an interesting idea here about like peace, being able to arrive when you interact with this sense of like concern for other people, because once you care about other people and their concerns, like it's like your own worries seem much less important within that context, right? And that's how you're able to find peace, right? So it's about duality, about holding different points of view in meditation, in deep contemplation, and caring, right? Caring enough about other people to be like, okay, I have this point of view and these ideas and this form of thinking, but this other person has a different way of seeing and viewing things, and that is equally as important. Like, how can I make space within myself and within my mind, right, to bring these things together to maintain cohesion and maintain union, regardless of the opposing, right? Mars, then we see the axes with Aries coming, right? To maintain that cohesion. And there's so much responsibility when it comes to maintaining cohesion that people don't understand about Libra, because it is so much easier nowadays to be like, you know, F you, you know, like, screw this, I'm out, you know, this is what I think. It's so much easier to, at least maybe because I have Mars in the first house, like really close to my ascendant as well, it just feels easier to only experience what you want to experience, right? But now thinking about Saturn's exaltation in the sign, like it is a big responsibility, right, to include everybody. It's the harder path, really, you know, than just choosing yourself. So yeah, I really bring this quote from, again, the Picatrix about like good judgment, right? Good judgment comes through not through argumentation, but actually through meditation, through like sitting with it and seeing what comes up and how much space you can make for space. There we go, that airy equality, right? For other people's ideas and experiences to come in and create, you know, two out of individual ones.
No, I think that's really beautiful. I think you've done such a good job of giving us a great understanding of not only how the decans work, but how it works in this first decan of Libra. And it was making, when you were talking, I was thinking about how sometimes or often Libra can be associated negatively with the idea of passivity and being passive. But actually, when you explain the idea and the responsibility that takes and the character that it takes to be able to hold two opposing ideas or different perspectives, or to you know, allow someone else's own ideas to kind of merge with your own, it's not easy, it's not passive, it's actually incredibly important, and it's very cohesive. So I think it's been a great way of just understanding that nuance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think that's a beautiful point about almost the strength of character it takes, in contradistinction to the type of strength of character that Aries must have, you know, being self-assertive and so forth, and how it takes both. And as well, the other a related point that went through my mind when you were talking, Michelle, about that was, you know, thinking to my professional world, including everybody, that was the phrase you used, and thinking about inclusion and collaboration, working collaboratively, it takes more work. It's actually easier just to go off and do things you're good at and do them yourself in your own, you know, and it's kind of satisfying in a way. But if you really want to bring everyone along and you want to let everyone contribute and for people to grow and develop as you go, if you want to manage things that way, it takes more hard work, and that's almost that Saturnian dimension coming in again as well.
Absolutely. Like it takes a lot of responsibility and tact to navigate complex relationships, much more than it does saying screw it, like I'm just gonna do it myself, right? So absolutely, right. There is, out of all of the decans of Libra, I would say, because it is co-ruled by the moon and Venus, and I'll read you guys the description from the Picatrix. It's very humanizing in a very public way. So the Picatrix describes the first face or decan, right? Interchangeable words, as a man with a lance in his right hand and in his left hand holds a bird hanging by its feet. This is a face of justice, truth, good judgment, complete justice for the people, and weak persons in doing good for beggars. Right. I'm gonna just let it sink in for you guys a little bit. Immediately when I read this passage, it's like justice for the people. The people is ruled by the moon. It's the public, right? There is this sense about caring about people, right, in general. And then there's this the interesting image of like somebody holding like pretty much a weapon in a right hand, and then in your left hand you're holding this like fragile bird, right? And there's this like dichotomy again. Libra is very dualistic, right? It's not a mutable sign, but it's still so dualistic, right? This is a quote from Kira Ryberg, and she describes this idea of like the lance and the bird as like representing good and evil, right? Right and wrong, mercy and justice, having to gauge between them. It's like with Libra, it's the exaltation of Saturn, right? Like judgment is gonna like smack down and you know, judge, right? But then there's the ability and the tact to also be very vulnerable, right? And very gracious when it comes to fragility, that I think Libra is really good at holding both of these within itself. And even like Valens describes Libra as anthropomorphic, right? Sorry, this is such a long-winded word. Anthropomorphism comes from the Greek words anthropos, meaning human, and morphe, which means to form or shape, which is the attribution of human form, character, or attributes to non-human entities. It's literally like humanizing something that isn't human, right? So there's a sense of humanity to this decan. You know, if we pull back this idea, this description of like justice for the people from the Picatrix, and then Valens describing it as anthropomorphic. It's like about humanizing things, humanizing ideas, humanizing people, right? That really stands out to me in the first decan of Libra, and as someone who was consulted with quite a lot of people for the past 2 years, like every time that I have a client and they have first decan Libra, they're either in some sort of like law work, right? Social justice, right? Like they care about people and they care about humans and they care about society, right? And that really stands out to me. Even in the 3 books of occult philosophy, Agrippa describes an angry man with a pipe and goes on to state that it is a face of helping the miserable and weak against the powerful and wicked, right? So it's the duality again of like something that can be quite angry and powerful and weapon-like, right? Existing alongside this much more vulnerable, like weak. We see the word like weak, miserable, like again, helping the weak persons, right? So there's this idea that Libra is able to hold these different, you know, dualistic experiences within itself and then come to a good judgment about it, right? And then on top of that, with the Two of Swords, right, it does take a lot of internal work, internal meditation to be like, okay, how do I, you know, bring both of these, you know, good and bad into cohesion to a place where people do think it's fair. And I think that is so freaking hard to include everybody, right? So when people are giving Libra slack about, oh my God, they can't decide, it's like, it's because they're trying to include everybody equally. And that
Yeah.
is truly so damn hard, right? And such a heavy responsibility. So yeah, I'll hand it back to you guys.
No, I mean, honestly, I could talk to you about this all day. And what I picked up was your point around humanizing, and it made me think around how the scales is the only, like Libra's the only one represented by an inanimate object.
Hmm.
And it just made me think maybe that's why they're able to humanize, because they're coming from a different place of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, um, yeah, I don't know. I would love to hear what Helen has to think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said there. And the other thing that was going through my mind as well was the cognitive work of holding opposing perspectives at the same time and recognizing duality. And that's another Saturnian air theme where you're having to work significantly harder to see the other's perspective. And you could imagine that, people like relationship counselors and things like that, they must be doing working overdrive, even, setting aside their own perspective and helping to other people to kind of both see each other's perspectives enough, and to be able to articulate that. Again, I think it's just another example of what you were saying, Michelle, about what's beneath the surface with the stereotypical Libran trying to keep the peace. And I know others have made this kind of analogy before, and I've seen it on social media, so this is not my own, but thinking about the swan, and the kind of the effortless grace of the Venusian and that you see underneath the surface of the water. They're working really hard to actually make that happen and keep that going, and also to maintain the appearances that people want and need, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. It reminds me of ballerinas, right?
Mm.
Behind a beautiful point toe, right? It's a crushing, but like your toe is crushing in that shoe, you know. It takes so much effort and time and dedication to appear that weightless, right? I think people don't realize about Libra. Like it's just it may appear to be easy to get along with everybody, but that's not real. It's not real, but like it's much more difficult, than it may seem at first glance. And I really like you pointing out, Helen, this idea of like the cognitive faculty of like literally making space for other people's thoughts and experiences within your own cognitive facilities. And yeah, like this decan is co-ruled by Moon and Venus. Like the Moon for me is the brain, right? The Moon for me is like the cognitive ability. Apart or obviously with Mercury, but this idea of like brain and brain capabilities really fits well with the Moon. And just to say something about like Moon, Venus ruling this decan, when I think about the combination of like Moon and Venus, Venus doesn't really like to be around the moon, right? In the sense that the moon waxes and wanes. The moon is far too fast and quick moving for Venus. At the end of the day, Venus wants devotion, right? Again, Saturn exalts in Libra, right? It wants stability, it wants commitment. So whenever Venus is near the moon, it's like it's too fast paced, too ever changing for Venus to really feel comfortable or nourished, right? And I think in this sense, when we think about how it fits with Libra one and the topics that we've talked about, is that like people's thoughts and perspectives change all the time. Their preferences may change, their ideas may change, right? It's like, how do we make space for that inevitability of change right? When it comes to dealing with our own thoughts or the thoughts of other people, right? And a lot of compassion, right, needs to be had to be able to do something like that, right? So again, that's just a connection that I made with what you were talking about.
And just if I could add one thing to that as well, because when you were speaking, I was thinking about the phrase emotional intelligence and leadership, thinking about Saturn and Libra, but actually you were bringing that back to the moon. And the moon is
Mm-hmm.
as you say, it's actually a function of mind. We think of Mercury,
Mm-hmm.
Mercury's the analytical component of mind, but
Mm-hmm.
the moon is the embodied mind and the
Mm-hmm.
compassionate one,
Yes.
thinking about others' feelings, relating, having
Yes.
empathy, and that tension between Venus and the moon as like the two traditional kind of feminine aspects, but they're very different reflections, and holding all that together. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I also have been thinking about, I kept thinking about leadership as we've been talking about this as well, and that's that Saturn exalting in Libra, and how that model of leadership again looks easier than it actually is, but how much more effective it is in terms of, I mean, I suppose there's probably times when you want something Martian and Aryan and let it just be decisive and someone has to
Mm-hmm.
make a call and just get something done. But then, you know, within the structures of organizations and groups and things that bring people together, there has to be that element of um, well, I suppose bringing all of those components together in
Mm-hmm.
a way, and there's like a reconciling of a lot of dualities within that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Such a great point about like emotional intelligence being key to leadership. Like it reminds me of this quote. I'm recently watching Downton Abbey. And there's a character called Mr. Carson who is like the leader of, the servants downstairs. If the listeners know anything about Downton Abbey, and he's described as there's like a quote from the character that said like people are loyal to Mr. Carson because he is kind, right? And I think that really speaks to Libra in general, and this, Decan of Libra. The kindness is, it takes, yeah, a lot to lead with that, like that emotional intelligence that you um, mentioned, that intuitive sense to know, okay, when is this too much? When should I check in? When should I push, and be a little bit more stern, right? That speaks very well to Saturn's exaltation in Libra, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I had leadership down as well, and thinking about that Aries axis, and our team leader is an Libra, sorry. And so bringing it back to like an organizational or work setting, I have been able to witness the way in which she has been able to really very strategically pinpoint our strengths in the team and bring us together cohesively. We've been all working from home. We haven't been in the office as much. And she has reintroduced like a monthly get together. And honestly, our team has really grown because of it, because we've been able to connect. But that's all come back to the team leader and her Libra kind of qualities and how she's been able to lead rather than what can I do alone? It's what can we do together? And so I think it's really interesting that both of you kind of pulled upon that point, and that's like a real life example of where I've seen that Libra leadership, where normally you might not associate that.
Hmm. I think the last thing I would say about the first decan before we can move on to I guess, the second decan is this idea of like buying and selling, right? Ibn Ezra describes it as a man in a shop in the market with scales in his hand, and he wishes to buy and sell, while the Yavana Jataka describes a man in the marketplace with the implements of his trade prepared. Like this idea of exchange, not just of like ideas, right? Really comes up strongly in the first decan, because to be in a society, right, there's exchange of ideas, but there's also exchange of goods. That's a part of like the mortal human aspect of living in a society that we kind of can't ignore, right? Um, and Kopic says that the combination of like Moon and Venus makes someone good at like ascertaining value to things. Like ascertaining value is Venus, to things, to assets, to objects would be the Moon, right? So I think the way that ties back to this idea of like leadership is like what you mentioned about being able to ascertain value, strengths, right?
Hmm.
Being able to see, okay, well, this is where we're strong. This is where we're a little less weak. No, a little less weak. Sorry. This is where we're a little weaker, right? So the idea of being able to see the value in things as well as a form of leadership really shows up in the first decan as well.
Mhm. So would you like to then take the next two decans in turn and just kind of like contrast if there are any differences with them, and then we'll kind of move on to thinking about the progressment.
Yeah, so Libra Decan II is a double Saturn ruled decan. Might seem a little bit scary at first glance, but there's quite a lot there to kind of balance things out as you will, right, with Libra. It's called Two Links of a Chain by Austin Coppock. T.S. Chang calls it Ties That Bind. And then it's simply called Sorrow in Book T and the Book of Thoth, right? The representative card for the second decan of Libra is the Three of Swords. For people listening, it's just the image of a heart pierced by three swords under pouring rain. And usually this card has that signification of like heartbreak, right? Literally have something piercing your heart. And the best way that I could describe it is the price we pay for the people or the things we are chained to. Right. For me, with the Three of Swords, there's this idea of like, you could avoid suffering by just never interacting with anybody ever again, right? But then is it worth never loving again, right? Do you exclude yourself from a situation to avoid sorrow, or are you willing to never partake in connection and love with other people, right? It's almost like this idea of like, regardless of how much you love or how you love, like it is a risk, right? And that's what this middle decan is about. So just a quote from T.S. Chang. So when Saturn, Lord of Commitments and Unbreakable Bonds, combines with the legal finalities of Libra, the result is a promise. You can think of the Three of Swords as this: the two parties to the agreement plus the agreement itself. The promise itself, in other words, is the third thing: the deal, the contract, the marriage, the life. So this decan is about oaths, it's about commitments, it's about promises, it's about the word as a bond, right? It has much to say about the reciprocity of relationships, whatever the nature may be, right? Romantic, platonic, familiar, or business, right? This decan has equal parts somber descriptions as per the Three of Swords, and its accompanying double rulership with Saturn. Yet it also expresses images of tranquility, joy, abundance, and good living. And this is a quote directly from the Picatrix, right? This reflects the difficult yet rewarding process of being in union with others and the risk, right, or eventual price to be paid when we are chained to certain terms and agreements. So here, commitments must be done earnestly if one wishes to reap the benefits of an investment. And Saturn's rulership also shows what happens when you don't fulfill or keep your oaths, right? This idea of like sorrow. So this is where much of Saturn's sorrows come in. So do you spend your entire life alone without suffering, because you're not interacting with somebody in a way that they could hurt you, right? Or do you love nevertheless, even if it risks getting your heart broken? So there's this idea of like the second decan of Libra of like, regardless of the nature of the relationship, there will always be a risk to that, but the risk is worth it, right? This idea of tranquility and peace, of like a good marriage, right, comes from taking that risk of like, yes, I know you, I'm giving you, you know, I'm showing you which buttons you can press that can really hurt me, but I'm trusting you that you won't. And through that trust, you can create something long lasting and beautiful and joyous and quote unquote the good life, right? So it really emphasizes this idea, especially people who have middle decan, and my moon is here, right? It's like oaths are really important. The people that you're chained to and committed to are really important. You got to think that through really, really well, right? because there are consequences to signing contracts and agreement with people, and also possibly even like moving past the fear of commitment or committing to other people, right? Yes, it could go bad, but yes, it could go really well, right? There is that, again, dualistic experience of Libra. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that incredibly beautiful and very moving. I think even at the beginning there, when you said it's the price we pay, it almost echoes that Venusian function to do with values of what things are worth, and it is worth it. And there is going to be heartbreak at some stage if you trust people and open your heart and get into close relationships. And that's part and parcel with it. But also thinking about empathy as well, and how even vicariously we can, but by becoming close to and invested in and caring about others, we can also suffer indirectly by feeling their pain and their suffering.
Yeah, no, I think what you've both been saying has been really resonating with me, and it feels like the second decan of Venus speaks to that exaltation in Saturn, and it really brings together that relationship between the two planets, which I think on the surface, when you're first kind of probably dipping your toes into astrology, you might feel like, I can't really see how these two planets are even vibing. Like, what do they have in common? But I think, Michelle, you've been really good at being able to pull out why Saturn is so important when we think about Libra, and I think it links back to that essential idea of relationships and what it takes to make relationships work. It's hard work. They don't just happen. Like, you can have the fuzzy Venus moon like ideas of like love, but the reality of it is, well, where's the commitment? Where's the working through? Where's the understanding? And, empathy, I think Helen's a great word to think about that, because you do have to put yourself in other people's shoes to really gain their perspective, because too often we're looking from within ourselves outwards, and sometimes we have to have that kind of reflected back. So yes, it feels on the surface like a difficult decan, but when you actually start to dig beneath the surface, you see where the rewards are. And I think your idea of risk comes into that, because you always taking a risk, but that's where you get the big rewards. And it's whether you can kind of move through that fear, because we know that Saturn instills fear for a good reason. It's protective. We want to protect ourselves. But yeah, I think it's so poignant when we think about loneliness and being alone and choosing to protect our heart because we don't want it to get hurt. But what are we missing out on? What's the price that we pay?
Yeah, and with this decan, even though Saturn exalts in the third decan, and then we'll talk about that, I think middle decan Libra is just, in its essence, really explains and shows why Saturn exalts in the sign. And like with every investment, there's a risk. And I think that's the best way that I could kind of convey this decan in its most shortest form. But is it worth it to, like, isolate that's a really good word for Saturn, isolate yourself from these beautiful experiences because of the fear, as you said, Tara, right? Is that really a way of life? Is it worth living that way? Really poses that question.
Yeah, so you mentioned about the third decan. I've only got Pluto there. I say only, but it's like conjunct my IC, so I'm very interested in what this decan's
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, let's talk about Libra Decan III. So in the first, to kind of summarize, right? In the first decan, we kind of realize or awaken to the idea of making space for other people's opinions and experiences. In the second decan, right, we take that further, right, into commitment, right? What happens when we are in relationship with other people? And then in the third decan, for me, it's this idea of like taking these ideas of balance and peace and duality, and then how it reflects out into the world and within ourselves. Does that make sense? Right? So for example, it's ruled by Jupiter and Mercury, right? Which is really interesting. It'll make sense to you guys as I keep talking about it. It's called the gyroscope. I think I'm saying it right. The gyroscope by Austin Coppock. It's called the Widening Gyre by T.S. Chang. It's described as rest from strife in Book T, and then just truce in the Book of Thoth. It's represented by the Four of Swords, right? If for the people listening who don't know what it looks like, it's this appears to be a knight laying on some sort of, some people think maybe it's a bed, some think it's like a cemetery type of thing, right? With one sword underneath the bed and then four more on the wall, and then there's like this window, glass stained window with like light coming in, right? It's a very quite calm and meditative image, really. I really recommend people to pull up the image to see what I'm describing. But the Four of Swords represents this idea of truce, this idea of like rest from strife. It's this idea of preparation for re-entry into life. I don't know where I heard this story. It might have been in Austin Coppock's one of his lectures, but like knights used to go before they went off to war, or when they came back, they would have a moment of meditation to like collect their thoughts and bring it together, because they didn't know if they were gonna like die, right? And when they came back, it's like that preparation to re-enter life. It's this idea of like gratitude, right? Of like, I survived, and coming back together within yourself to collect yourself. And T.S. Chang describes this sleeping figure with different contexts. So it could either be death, right? Because people say, you know, when people die, it's like they say they rest in peace. I hope they are resting, right? A vigil, which is what I described about the knights who would pray over their armors the night before some sort of battle. It could be sleep. It could be meditation. Maybe this is a little bit more psychological, so Helen can bring in her perspective. But she mentions like active imagination, right? I think it's a Jungian term. And then also divination, right? That speaks to that as well. So she says there's a sense of inner concentration in the Four of Swords. The knight at rest, having found mental tranquility, removed from the whirl and bustle of life. It's about taking a break from the toiling and spinning imposed on us by the external world to explore the rich landscape of the inner world. So it represents collecting your thoughts, which lead to an expansion of your worldview, right? Expansion of your gratitude, which is very jovial, very Jupiterian, right? So it's the idea of like retreat and rest to restore natural equilibrium, right? So how does this fit in the decanic images? So in this final decan, we apply the balancing act of Libra to ourselves, our inner world, and the chaotic world we live in. Because remember how I said Libra is the story of what happens when we live in a society, right? Society is chaotic, right? And there is like a relationship between our inner world and the chaos of the universe, or of societies, right? That is inevitably still a relationship. So this is a decan of extremes, right? Images, there's a lot of images of like gluttony and excessive pleasure, but equally as much as those of meditative states, like the Four of Swords, right? Of sleep, of peace and tranquility. Austin Coppock describes it as a meditation at the center of a party, right? The hustle and bustle of life being met with the calm repose one takes after periods of excess. And this is like represented really well by Jupiter's rulership over this decan, right? This idea of like temperance, like tempering chocolate, right? When you temper chocolate, you increase the heat quite a lot, and then you bring it back down to coolness, right? So these big periods of expansion coming back down to like balance and equilibrium. That's the whole idea of Jupiter's tempering quality, right? So after big periods of chaos, there comes in that period of rest and inner balance. And then the co-rulership with Mercury, it's this idea of being able to adapt to the chaos, right? And with Mercury, it's like Mercury can mold into the chaos if need be, right? It can adapt to the chaos. And then with Jupiter, it's like about coming back to center, right? Adapting to the chaotic world that we live in, but also coming back down to center. And then that's what I meant by like Libra tells the story of all types of relationships, not just with other people, right? It's also with ourselves and with society, with the world, with the natural world, right? It's about balance in a much more broad term when we think about balancing our lives, right? Yeah, what do you guys think?
No, I think this is really interesting because when you were speaking about Mercury and Jupiter and balance, it made me think about the mutable signs and how Virgo and Pisces are obviously opposing and they're bringing in that Mercury Jupiterian angle. And then you've got Gemini and Sagittarius. So it made me think, yes, I can see why it kind of culminates. The Libra Decans culminate in this kind of duality, which you've kind of been talking about throughout, Michelle, in the sense that obviously Jupiter expands and Mercury wants to zoom in. And how do we find the balance between the two? How do we find the balance between the big ideas and the small details that underpin it? And it just made me think about those mutual duality and how they are two sides of the same coin, but they're all trying to achieve that kind of balance. So it really makes sense. And honestly, I've learned so much about Decans in this short amount of time. Like you, I think you explain it beautifully.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. I think the last thing that I would say about like this final decan of Libra, it reminds me a lot of the twisties in gymnastics. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. So this happened to Simone Biles I think a couple years ago, right? So the twisties are when you're twisting in like in the air in gymnastics, you sometimes can lose your internal balance in the sense that when you're twisting, you don't know which way is up or down, right? You kind of lose your sense of location as you're spinning midair, right? So you don't know how you're gonna land, you don't know where you're gonna land, right? You're just spinning, right? And losing sight of that internal like balance that allows you to control the spinning, right? Um, and Simone Biles mentions that the twisties comes from like a mind thing. Like if you're not centered within yourself and feeling like calm and at peace, right? That can happen when you're up in the air. So that's what it reminds me of this decan. Yeah, of sometimes you can lose control over a lot of aspects in your life when you lack that internal balance. It all comes back down to like this internal balance. And I even think Austin Coppock mentions it as like the eye of the storm. Like peace is within the eye of the storm, right? But yeah, that's the little last thing I would say about that.
If I could just add something to that before we move on
Mhm.
as well, because I'm really captivated by all of those metaphors and also the image of the Four of Swords in relation to that as well, because it made me wonder if there's something in, you were talking about mental state and when you're disoriented or discombobulated by the sort of large forces of life in that sort of tarot card image, there's almost a sense of detachment, maybe, and as a stage of that story, because you've got the way it shows the four swords is there's three of them mounted on the wall within the church behind the knight, and I see him, for what it's worth, as sort of a, just through my archaeologist eye, as like an effigy, but I think the
Mhm.
metaphor still holds of
Mhm.
meditative because he's absolutely at peace. And then there's one sword just beneath where he lies, and it's almost like that balance between mind and the three represented, thinking back to the Three of Swords, that's almost a crisis point. So you've been through
Mhm.
that crisis and things have come
Mhm.
to a head, and now you've got a little bit of quiet and distance, and that's maybe the way, and also the stained glass window could be, you mentioned Jung's active imagination, and it's almost like it could be the dream he's having about the outside
Mhm.
world, or about, and that's
Mhm.
Jupiterian as
Mhm.
well. And I just lastly want to relate that to back to the new moon that we're talking about in Libra
Mhm.
on the 21st of October, which is in this decan, and I'm wondering if there's anything in that in terms of how we approach it and how we make use of that water grand trine. Don't know if you've got any thoughts around that, Michelle, just before we move on.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we're looking at a new moon in this like Jupiter, Mercury, Decan, and then Mercury is gonna be with Mars in Scorpio. Whenever I see like m Mercury Mars, like immediately for me it's like arguments, debate, right? Severing opinions. I think of lawyers, right? Bold statements. Um, um, And Jupiter's also squaring this new moon, right? So I think there is something there to be said about finding the bigger picture and the calm and the peace, in the bigger picture. Um, um, when at times the world might seem like it's so chaotic and so martial in a sense. It's so these days have been so martial. Um, um, so finding some peace and respite, right? To see, okay, like the best way that we can really plan for our future as a society is at times to take a step back and also digest everything that's happening. And that might be really difficult, honestly, to completely, digest the everything that's been going on in the world. But I wonder if it will be an opportunity to take a step back and be like, okay, how can we move forward? What can I do? What's the best that I can do within my community, right? To further cohesion in such a divisive time, right? So that I was when we were looking at a new moon chart, my eyes were going to that Mars and that Mercury. Like if in some way it feels a little bit divisive, a little bit severing, right? But the new moon in this final decan really speaks to this ability to just like come back down, right? To natural equilibrium, okay, and see what's the best course of action after having thought things through, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. No, honestly, I could talk about this all day, but let's move on to some of your favorite lunar topics. What are they? Do you have any?
My favorite lunar topic is immediately going to be rejoicing of the moon. I know because it's a
Yes.
little biased because I have it in my chart and it's a very personal experience, but I think the third house, and the moon's rejoicing position here is so deeply magical and esoteric in some ways that might not be, obvious at first glance. Because when people think about the third house, it's like neighborhoods, right? Like siblings, cousins, like how could this fit in, right? But when you think about it, like when we first started divinating, like who were we divinating for? And still to this day, who do we divine for? Before I started doing this for consultations, I was doing it for my friends, for my community, for my siblings, for my cousins, right? It's a way to connect with other people. Um, I had written a blog before about the third house, and I described it as there is like magic in the mundane, right? For example, I see tweets online about being like, oh, I went on a walk and like had a moment of like divinity. And it's like, yes, that's the whole point, right? The moon brings down um um you know the magic of the world right down to an embodied place that I really, really love. And for me, the rejoicing position of the moon in the third house are things like, the secret lucky charm you have that you carry with you, right? The little lucky, what's that word? Ritual. There we go. The magic ritual that you take on every morning, right? To give you that
Mm.
little extra, you know, luck or connection, right? I think about going on a walk and having these big realizations, obviously with the opposing axis with the sun in the ninth exaltation, right? I think with the moon in the third in its rejoicing house, it like brings down the visions of God into a place that you can embody it and actually feel it rather than just this thing that you think about or philosophize about, right? Um, so yeah, there's so much to be said about the moon in the third house and why it's such an apt place for it to rejoice, yeah, it's deeply esoteric, deeply magical, deeply connective. And yeah, it's a great topic.
Yeah, and I love the word ritual, which sets it apart from routine. It elevates it into something that's
Mhm,
very personal and
mhm,
not it detracts from the daily grind of the sixth house. It's much more
mhm,
lunar. And actually, when you were talking about the third house, I was thinking about what you said earlier, Helen, about emotional intelligence, because obviously we think about the moon, the third house as our communication and how we communicate. But actually, the fact that the moon rejoices in that house links back to that idea of the mental not just being our analytical mind, but it's our emotional connection and how we can connect on that kind of communicative level.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I was kind of thinking of and kind of drawing that together.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost wanted to say like emotional mind
Mm,
in
yeah.
response to what you were saying, right? And yeah, it's such an apt place for what the moon is trying to do, right? Um, um, and yeah, it reminds me of people who, for example, have a favorite coffee shop that they go to and they have established, a repertoire with people there, and it's the people that get asked, like the regular, right? You want your regular, right? It's the ability to
Mhm.
connect with people, to sense other people, to sense things around you in your vicinity that is at the root of magic practices, ritualistic practices, right? That make you feel more centered, more connected, more emotionally open, right? So if people want to like connect with their moon, I really, really emphasize and recommend working with all things third house, right? Texting your friends more often, just to check in, right? Offering to help a neighbor, right? That's also very third housey. It creates the sense of community, very, very much so, in the sense that like 11th house community is more like like I know this person who knows this person, that could help me with this thing. But in the third house, it's much more embodied, right? It's like helping your neighbor carry their groceries from up the stairs. But if you get sick, they make you soup, right? It's a much more embodied way of interacting with the world around you, that really helps you put your feet on the ground, which I think I tend to lack because I have a lot of fire and air in my chart. And it's a great way to experience the magic of the mundane, the magic of being in relationship with other people, the magic that comes from just a simple walk, right, in your neighborhood. Magic is everywhere, right? And I think moon rejoicing in the third house really emphasizes that idea that even through the micro interactions that you have with people day to day, right, it's still almost like a ritual, saying hello to the same neighbor every single time, visiting the same coffee shop every single time. And there is this sense of joy that is connected to that, because obviously in the sixth house, right, it's the rejoicing house of Mars. It's like things that need to be done. It's like this thing that's like, the chores. It feels much more heavy to carry. But in the third, it's like ritualistic. What do I enjoy doing? What makes me feel more connected, more emotionally nurtured? Not just emotionally, but like physically nurtured, because the moon is also about that physicality, right? That allows us to feel our emotions. So yeah, I would recommend for anybody wanting to work with their moon to also work with their third house, to feel that sense of lunar connection, whether that be with other people or with your surroundings or even your own home, right? There's tons that can be done with the moon in the third house. I think in the most like practical way, right? Because with astrology, sometimes it tends to exist in a very philosophical, grand scheme, um, um, area. So with the moon in the third, it's like you're able to bring it down to embodiment, right? So yeah, it's great for practical use if people are seeking to remediate the moon.
I absolutely love that embodied dimension and how, because the moon, when we think about it, is the planetary body that mediates between kind of the physical world of matter and the
Mhm,
spiritual world.
mhm, mhm,
And when a light bulb went off when you were talking there about, for me, there's no better act of self-nurturing than going for a walk locally. And that's how I sort of filter through and process emotions and thoughts together through my body
mhm,
and
mhm,
really feel connected to the place around me. And I think you've really brought out the moon's joy in the third house really, really well. And I love the advice for people to kind of work with that, because it's things anyone can do. It's things that we all have
mhm,
access to that don't really cost anything usually. And
mhm,
I think that's
mhm,
really lovely.
mhm, mhm.
And I think the last thing I just wanted to ask, and it relates to like one of my favorite lunar topics, which is the secondary progressed moon.
Mhm.
And I don't know, Michelle, do you track yours? Do you know, and can you say a
Yeah,
bit about where yours is at the moment?
yeah. So I don't track them As much as I should, honestly, because I had a reading with Daniel the Lion. That's his Twitter ad. He's amazing, and he was talking about my progress moon, and I'm actually going through my progress new moon in Virgo, which speaks a lot to me uh independentizing myself, like moving out of my parents' house, focusing much more on skill and ability and like working as an astrologer, right? And re-emphasizing my skills by going back to school in some ways. But I have found the progress like new moons and full moons to be quite poignant when it comes to tracking like cycles in people's lives, like the seed being planted, right? And then it reaching full maturity. Like I've seen that for clients as well, and I've definitely seen that for myself. But yeah, I don't track it as much, but I really should.
And do you look at the natal house and the house in the progress chart that's in, and has that had a bearing on what your experience has been of the new moon?
Yeah, really good question. The ascendant is still in Leo, so the new moon is in the second house for both the progressed and natal. So yeah, it's been really interesting, this idea of like what supports you, right? Because even I think Kira Ryberg mentioned in her second house post about like how I think Valence also adds communities in the second house, right? It's anything that supports you. And obviously in a mercurial, sign, it really aligns well with my meeting you guys, right? Like having people to talk with about astrology and interacting with other people that love this mercurial thing. Yeah, it just speaks a lot to the face of my life right now, going back to school, very much preoccupied with skills, gaining skills, whether that be, technical skills or relationship skills, right? That supports my way of living, not just in the sense of like paying my rent, but as an astrologer or as a person, right? It really emphasizes the idea of like what supports me, what nourishes me, in the practical sense and also the emotional sense. And obviously because the sun is there, it's also like aspirationally, right? What nurtures me when it comes to meeting those and achieving my aspirations. So yeah. Yeah, it's been really interesting.
And I think what's also interesting is it'll be good to see or track when it moves into Libra, because then
Mm-hmm.
it's obviously your lunar return in
Mm-hmm.
progressions and your third house. And the fact that you've kind of relocated makes me think, I wonder how you're going to start to put down those roots in your local community when you have that progressed moon in Libra. I think that's going to be
Mm-hmm.
quite exciting to look ahead for.
Yeah, thank you for saying that because Venus will also move into Libra around that
Oh,
time. So it seems
nice.
like a really a really
Yeah.
nice, yeah, little progressed transit. Yeah.
Great. I mean, I've had so much fun talking to you, honestly. Your Jupiter in Gemini shines through, along with everything else. So it'd be great for anyone listening to find out a little bit more about your astrology services and how they can
Mhm.
kind of connect with you.
Yeah, of course. I've had such a wonderful t time talking with you guys as well. The time really does fly when you're having fun. We blinked and it's been almost 2 hours. Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter at Libra Moon Gal. Very fitting. And then on Blue Sky, I'm also at Libra Moon Gal. And but then you can also find me on my website for all forms of like consultation and services, which is michelliu.com. That's MICHELLIU.com. And then again on Instagram, I'm also at Michel Liu. So yeah, not hard to find.
Great. No,
Fantastic.
yeah, it's been amazing having you on. Thanks for all the listeners. I hope that this Libra new moon treats you well. And that's me, Tara, signing off.
Same for me. Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you guys. Thank you for having me.